Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 13 of Pawn of Prophecy. The palace of the King of Enheg of Cherrick was a vast brooding structure near the center of Val Alorn. Huge wings, many of them crumbled into decay with unpaned windows, staring emptily at the open sky through collapsed roofs, stretched out from the main building in all directions. So far as Garion could tell, there was no plan to the palace whatsoever. It had, it seemed, merely grown over the 3,000 years and more that the King of Cherrick had ruled there. "Why is so much of it empty and broken down like that?" he asked Beric as their sleigh whirled into the snow-packed courtyard. "What some kings build, other kings let fall down," Beric said shortly. "It's the way of kings." Beric's mood had been black since their encounter with the blind woman at the temple. The others had all dismounted and stood waiting. "You've been away from home too long if you can get lost on the way from the harbor to the palace," Silk said pleasantly. "We were delayed," Beric grunted. A broad, iron-bound door at the top of the wide steps that led up to the palace opened then as if someone behind it had been waiting for them all to arrive. A woman with long flaxen braids and wearing a deep scarlet cloak trimmed with rich fur stepped out onto the portico at the top of the stairs and stood looking down at them. "Greetings, Lord Beric, Earl of Trelhem and husband," she said formally. Beric's face grew even more somber. "Merrill," he acknowledged with a court nod. "King Enheg granted me permission to greet you, my lord," Beric's wife said, "as is my right and my duty." "You've always been most attentive to your duties, Merrill," Beric said. "Where are my daughters?" "At Trelhem, my lord," she said. "I didn't think it would be a good idea for them to travel so far in the cold." There was a faintly malicious note in her voice. Beric sighed. "I see," he said. "Was I in error, my lord?" Merrill asked. "Let it pass," Beric said. "If you and your friends are ready, my lord," she said, "I'll escort you to the throne room." Beric went up the stairs, briefly and rather formally embraced his wife, and the two of them went through the wide doorway. "Tragic," the Earl of Selene murmured, shaking his head as they all went up the stairs to the palace door. "Hardly that," Silk said. "After all, Beric got what he wanted, didn't he?" "You're a cruel man, Prince Keldar," the Earl said. "Not really," Silk said. "I'm a realist, that's all. Beric spent all those years yearning after Merrill, and now he's got her. I'm delighted to see such steadfastness rewarded. Aren't you?" The Earl of Selene sighed. A party of mailed warriors joined them and escorted them through a maze of corridors, up the broad stairs, and down narrow ones, deeper and deeper into the vast pile. "I've always admired Cherrick architecture," Silk said sardonically. "It's so unanticipated. Expanding the palace gives weak kings something to do," King Furlek observed. "It's not a bad idea, really. In Sandaria, bad kings usually devote their time to street paving projects, but all of Alorn was paved thousands of years ago." Silk laughed. "It's always been a problem, Your Majesty," he said. "How do you keep bad kings out of mischief?" "Prince Keldar," King Furlek said, "I don't wish your uncle any misfortune, but I think it might be very interesting if the crown of Drasnia just happened to fall to you." "Please, Your Majesty," Silk said with feigned shock, "don't even suggest that." "Also a wife," the Earl of Selene said slyly. "The prince definitely needs a wife." "That's even worse," Silk said with a shudder. The throne room of King Enheg was a vaulted chamber with a great fire pit in the center where whole logs blazed and crackled. Unlike the lushly draped hall of King Furlek, the stone walls here were bare, and torches flared and smoked in iron rings sunk in the stone. The men who lounged near the fire were not the elegant courtiers of Furlak's court, but rather were bearded Cherrick warriors, gleaming in chainmail, At one end of the room sat 5 thrones, each surmounted by a banner. 4 of the thrones were occupied, and 3 regally looking women stood talking nearby. Furlak, king of Sandaria, one of the warriors who had escorted them boomed, striking the butt of his spear hollowly on the rush-strewn floor. Hail, Furlak! A large, black-bearded man on one of the thrones called, rising to his feet. His long blue robe was wrinkled and spotted, and his hair was shaggy and unkempt. The gold crown he wore was dented in a place or two, and one of its points had been broken off. King Enheg, the king of the Sendars, replied, bowing slightly. The throne awaits thee, my dear Furlak, the shaggy-haired man said, indicating the banner of Sandaria behind the one vacant throne. The kings of Aloria welcome the wisdom of the king of Sandaria at this council. Garion found the stilted, archaic form of address strangely impressive. Which king is which, friend Silk? Thurnick whispered as they approached the thrones. The fat one in the red robe with the reindeer on the banner is my uncle, Rodar of Drasnia. The lean-faced one in black under the horse banner is Chohag of Algaria. The big, grim-faced one in gray with no crown who sits beneath the sword banner is Brand, the Riven warder. Brand? Garion interrupted, startled as he remembered the stories of the Battle of Omimber. All Riven warders are named Brand, Silk explained. King Furlak greeted each of the other kings in the formal language that seemed to be customary, and then he took his place beneath the green banner with its golden sheaf of wheat that was the emblem of Sandaria. Hail, Belgarath, disciple of Alder, Engheg said, and hail, Lady Polgara, honored daughter of immortal Belgarath. There's little time for all this ceremony, Engheg, Mr. Wolf said tartly, throwing back his cloak and striding forward. Why have the kings of Aloria summoned me? Permit us our little ceremonies, ancient one, Rodar, the grossly fat king of Drasnia, said slightly. We so seldom have the chance to play king. We won't be much longer at it. Mr. Wolf shook his head in disgust. One of the 3 regal-looking women came forward then. She was a tall, raven-haired beauty in an elaborately cross-tied black velvet gown. She curtsied to King Furlak and touched her cheek briefly to his. Your Majesty, she said, your presence honors our home. Your Highness, Furlak replied, inclining his head respectfully. Queen is Lena, Silk murmured to Dernick and Garion, and Heg's wife. The little man's nose twitched with suppressed mirth. Watch her when she greets Polgara. The queen turned and curtsied deeply to Mr. Wolf. Divine Belgarath, she said, her rich voice throbbing with respect. Hardly divine is Lena, the old man said dryly. Immortal son of Alder, she swept on, ignoring the interruption. Mightiest sorcerer in all the world. My poor house trembles at the awesome power you bring within its walls. A pretty speech, Islana, Wolf said. A little inaccurate, but pretty all the same. But the queen had already turned to Aunt Paul. Glorious sister, she intoned. Sister? Garion was startled. She's a mystic, Silk said softly. She dabbles a bit in magic and thinks of herself as a sorceress. Watch. With an elaborate gesture, the queen produced a green jewel and presented it to Aunt Paul. She had it up her sleeve, Silk whispered gleefully. A royal gift, Islana, Aunt Paul said in a strange voice. A pity that I can only offer you this in return. She handed the queen a single deep red rose. Where did she get that? Garion asked in amazement. Silk winked at him. The queen looked at the rose doubtfully and cupped it between her 2 hands. She examined it closely, and her eyes widened. The color drained out of her face, and her hands began to tremble. The second queen had stepped forward. She was a tiny blonde with a beautiful smile. Without ceremony, she kissed King Furlak and then Mr. Wolf and embraced Aunt Paul warmly. Her affections seemed simple and unself-conscious. Poren, Queen of Drasnia, Silk said, and his voice had an odd note to it. Garion glanced at him and saw the faintest hint of a bitter, self-mocking expression flicker across his face. In that single instant, as clearly as if it had suddenly been illuminated by a bright light, Garion saw the reason for Silk's sometimes strange manner. An almost suffocating surge of sympathy welled up in his throat. The third queen, Selar of Algaria, greeted King Furlak, Mr. Wolf, and Aunt Paul with a few brief words in a quiet voice. "Is the Riven warder unmarried?" Dernick asked, looking around for another queen. "He has a wife," Silk said shortly, his eyes still on Queen Poren, "but she died some years ago. She left him 4 sons. "Ah," Dernick said. Then Beric, grim-faced and obviously angry, entered the hall and strode to King Enheg's throne. "Welcome home, cousin," King Enheg said. "I thought perhaps you'd lost your way." "Family business, Enheg," Beric said. "I had to have a few words with my wife." "I see," Enheg said and let it drop. "Have you met our friends?" Beric asked. "Not as yet, Lord Beric," King Rodar said. "We were involved with the customary formalities." He chuckled and his great paunch jiggled. "I'm sure you all know the Earl of Selene," Beric said. "And this is Dernick, a smith and brave man. The boy's name is Garion. He's in Lady Polgara's care. A good lad." "Do you suppose we could get on with this?" Mr. Wolf asked impatiently. Chohag, king of the Algars, spoke in a strangely soft voice. "Art thou aware, Belgarath, of the misfortune which hath befallen us? We turn to thee for counsel." "Chohag," Wolf said testily, "you sound like a bad Orendish epic. If all this theeing and thouing really necessary..." Chohag looked embarrassed and glanced at King Enheg. "My fault, Belgarath," Enheg said ruefully. "I set scribes to work to record our meetings. Chohag was speaking to history as well as to you." His crown had slipped a bit and perched precariously over one ear. "History's very tolerant, Enheg," Wolf said. "You don't have to try to impress her. She'll forget most of what we say anyway." He turned to the Riven warder. "Brand," he said, "do you suppose you could explain all this without too much embellishment?" "I'm afraid it's my fault, Belgarath," the grey-robed warder said in a deep voice. "The apostate was able to carry off his theft because of my laxity." "The thing's supposed to protect itself, Brand," Wolf told him. "I can't even touch it. I know the thief, and there's no way you could have kept him out of Riva. What concerns me is how he was able to lay hands on it without being destroyed by its power." Brand spread his hands helplessly. "We woke one morning and it was gone. The priests were able to divine the name of the thief. The spirit of the bear god wouldn't say any more. Since we knew who he was, we were careful not to speak his name or the name of the thing he took." "Good," Wolf said. "He has ways to pick words out of the air at great distances. I taught him how to do that myself." Brand nodded. "We knew that," he said. "It made phrasing our message to you difficult. When you didn't come to Riva and my messenger didn't return, I thought something had gone wrong. That's when we sent men out to find you." Mr. Wolf scratched at his beard. "I guess it's my own fault that I'm here then," he said. "I borrowed your messenger. I had to get word to some people in Arendia. I suppose I should have known better." Syl cleared his throat. "May I ask," he said politely. "Certainly, Prince Keldar," King Enheg said. "Is it entirely prudent to continue these discussions in public?" Silk asked. "The Murgos have enough gold to buy ears in many places, and the arts of the Grolums can lift the thoughts out of the minds of the most loyal warriors. What isn't known can't be revealed, if you take my meaning." "The warriors of Enheg aren't so easily bought, Silk," Beric said testily. "And there aren't any Grolums in Cherik." "Are you also confident about the serving men and the kitchen wenches?" Silk suggested. "And I found Grolums in some very unexpected places." "There's something in what my nephew says," King Rodar said, his face thoughtful. "Drasnia has centuries of experience in the gathering of information, and Keldar is one of our best. If he thinks that our words might go further than we'd want them to, we might be wise to listen to him." "Thank you, Uncle," Silk said, bowing. Could you penetrate this palace, Prince Kildar? King Enheg challenged. I already have, your majesty, Silk said modestly, 12 times or more. Enheg looked at Rodar with one raised eyebrow. Rodar coughed slightly. It was some time ago, Enheg. Nothing serious. I was just curious about something, that's all. All you had to do was ask, Egghead said in a slightly injured tone. I didn't want to bother you, Rodar said with a shrug. Besides, it's more fun to do it the other way. Friends, King Furlag said, the issue before us is too important to chance compromising it. Wouldn't it be better to be overcautious rather than take any risks? King Enheg frowned, then shrugged. Whatever you wish, he said. We'll continue in private, then. Cousin, would you clear old Eldrig's hall for us and set guards in hallways near it? I will, Enheg, Beric said. He took 12 warriors and left the hall. The kings rose from their thrones, all except Chohag, a lean warrior, very nearly as tall as Beric, and with the shaved head and flowing scalp. Locke of the Algars stepped forward and helped him up. Garion looked inquiringly at Silk. An illness when he was a child, Silk explained softly. It left his legs so weak that he can't stand unaided. Doesn't that make it kind of hard for him to be king? Garion asked. Algars spend more time sitting on horses than they do standing on their feet, Silk said. Once he's on a horse, Chohag's the equal of any man in Algaria. The warrior who's helping him is Hedar, his adopted son. You know him? Garion asked. I know everyone, Garion, Silk laughed softly. Hedar and I have met a few times. I like him, though. I'd rather he didn't know that. Queen Peren came over and to where they stood. Islana's taking Silar and me to her private quarters, she said to Silk. Apparently, women aren't supposed to be involved in matters of state here in Cherik. Our Cherik cousins have a few blind spots, Your Highness, Silk said. They're arch-conservatives, of course, and it hasn't occurred to them yet that women are human. Queen Peren winked at him with a sly little grin. I'd hoped that we might get a chance to talk, Keldar. But it doesn't look like it now. Did you get my message to Layla? Silk nodded. She said she'd write to you immediately, he said. If we'd known you were going to be here, I would have carried her letter myself. It was Islana's idea, she said. She decided that it might be nice to have a council of queens while the kings were meeting. She have invited Layla too, but everyone knows how terrified she is of sea travel. Has your council produced anything momentous, Highness? Silk asked lightly. Queen Peren made a face. We sit around and watch Islana do tricks, disappearing coins, things up her sleeves, that kind of thing, she said. Or she tells fortunes. Silar is too polite to object, and I'm the youngest, so I'm not supposed to say too much. It's terribly dull, particularly when she goes into trances over that stupid crystal ball of hers. Did Layla think she could help me? If anyone can, Silk assured her. I should warn you, though, that her advice is likely to be quite explicit. Queen Layla's an earthy little soul, and sometimes very blunt. Queen Peren giggled wickedly. That's all right, she said. I'm a grown woman, after all. Of course, Silk said. I just wanted to prepare you, that's all. Are you making fun of me, Keldar, she asked. Would I do that, Your Highness? Silk asked, his face full of innocence. I think you would, she said. Coming, Peren? Queen Islana asked from not too far away. At once, Your Highness, the Queen of Drasnia said, her fingers flickered briefly at Silk. What a bore! Patience, Highness, Silk gestured in reply. Queen Peren docilely followed the stately Queen of Cherik and the silent Queen of Algaria from the hall. Silk's eyes followed her, and his face had the same self-mocking expression as before. The others are leaving, Garion said delicately, and pointed to the far end of the hall where the Alorn kings were just going out the door. All right, Silk said, and led the way quickly after them. Garion stayed at the rear of the group, and they all made their way through the drafty quarters toward King Eldric's hall. The dry voice in his mind told him that if Aunt Paul saw him, she'd probably find a reason to send him away. As he loitered along at the rear of the procession, a furtive movement flickered briefly far down one of the side corridors. He caught only one glimpse of the man, an ordinary-looking Cherrick warrior wearing a dark green cloak, and then they had moved past that corridor. Garion stopped and stepped back to look again, but the man in the green cloak was gone. At the door to King Eldric's hall, Aunt Paul stood waiting with her arms crossed. "Where have you been?" she asked. "I was just looking," he said as innocently as possible. "I see," she said, then turned to Beric. "The council's probably going to last for a long time," she said. "And Garion's just going to get restless before it's over. Is there some place where he can amuse himself until supper time?" "Aunt Paul," Garion protested. "The armory, perhaps?" Beric suggested. "What would I do in an armory?" Garion demanded. "Would you prefer the scullery?" Aunt Paul asked pointedly. "On second thought, I think I might like to see the armory." "I thought you might." "It's at the far end of the corridor, Garion," Beric said. "The room with the red door." "Run along, dear," Aunt Paul said, "and try not to cut yourself on anything." Garion sulked slowly down the corridor Beric had pointed out to him, keenly feeling the injustice of the situation. The guards posted in the passageway outside King Eldric's hall even made eavesdropping impossible. Garion sighed and continued his solitary way through the armory. The other part of his mind was busy, however, mulling over certain problems. Despite his stubborn refusal to accept the possibility that Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul were indeed Belgarath and Polgara, the behavior of the Alorn kings made it obvious that they at least did believe it. Then there was the question of the rose Aunt Paul had given to Queen Islana. Setting aside the fact that roses do not bloom in the winter, how had Aunt Paul known that Islana would present her with that green jewel and therefore prepared the rose in advance? He deliberately avoided the idea that his aunt had simply created the rose on the spot. The corridor along which he passed, deep in thought, was dim, and only a few torches set in rings on the walls to light the way. Side passages branched out from it here and there, gloomy, unlighted openings that stretched back into the darkness. He had almost reached the armory when he heard a faint sound in one of the dark passages. Without knowing exactly why, he drew back into one of the other openings and waited. The man in the green cloak stepped out into the lighted corridor and looked around furtively. He was an ordinary-looking man with a short, sandy beard, and he probably could have walked anywhere in the palace without attracting much notice. His manner, however, and his stealthy movements cried out louder than words that he was doing something he was not supposed to be doing. He hurried up the corridor in the direction where Garion had come, and Garion shrank back into the protective darkness of his hiding place. When he carefully poked his head out into the corridor again, the man had disappeared, and it was impossible to know down which of those dark side passageways he had gone. Garion's inner voice told him that even if he told anyone about this, they wouldn't listen. He'd need more than just an uneasy feeling of suspicion to report if he didn't want to appear foolish. All he could do for the time being was to keep his eyes open for the man in the green cloak.